Hello, this is Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it would be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we're back on the Archaeo SMP server, and it's time to do something about that village on the far side of my base across the lake. This season on Archaeo SMP, I'm placing builds around the central lake in my area based on where they fall in history. So that's why the Neolithic builds are over here in this area, but on the far side of the lake where the village lay corresponds to the late Roman to early medieval era, and so I thought it would be fun to recreate the current village as a building from the Goths. Specifically, I'm building a Visigothic villa that was home to a count during the fall of that Visigothic kingdom of Spain. The Goths were a tribal confederacy during the migration period of the late Roman era, and as you learn as I tell the tale of their people, were divided into two main groups, the Visigoths, or West Goths, and the Ostrogoths, or East Goths. The Visigoths were the first to migrate into the borders of Rome along the Danube River on account of pressures from a steppe people I'm sure you've heard of, named the Huns. The Ostrogoths, as you'll hear during the episode, were at that time of the Visigothic migration under the sway of the Huns, but did end up migrating as their Visigothic cousins did before them to the west, pushing them into the orbit of the Roman Empire. The Goths were a Germanic people whose legendary origins, so what they believed about their own origins, say they came from a great northern island called Skansa, in other words, Scandinavia. They crossed the sea and then migrated south into the area now known as Ukraine. The Romans didn't have direct contact at that time with the peoples of Scandinavia, but when the Goths did come into contact with Rome, it was clear from those Roman descriptions that their culture was Germanic in origin, so that does fit. It's also clear that the Goths were a different cultural group from the neighboring cultures of the steppe, as the Goths usually used infantry troops and not predominantly horse archers like the other steppe peoples. Additionally, what the archaeology of the area shows is that there was a new cultural group of people that appeared in and around Kiev and also Transylvania around when Rome started writing about the Goths. Said another way, you have the Gothic stories of migrating from the north into an area that's now Romania and Ukraine around the same time that both Roman sources start mentioning a new Germanic peoples making contact for the first time, and archaeologically a new Germanic peoples whose culture is distinct from surrounding steppe peoples, so all that evidence seems to fit together pretty well. From a chronology perspective, they appeared at the time called by Roman historians as the Roman crisis of the 3rd century. This was the time from around AD 235 to 284 where the Roman Empire was at times near collapse with rapidly changing emperors, economic depression, and civil wars. This was also around the same time as the Franks, who ended up in what's now France, and the Sassanids, who were in the Middle East where Parthia was, or before them, the Persians were based. So basically, the Goths appear as a people during a time of massive disruption in the late Roman Empire, as well as a time of great destabilization in a load of other cultures around Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. The Goths, in around the AD 240s or so, started raiding over the Danube into Roman territory, which was weakened, as I said, due to the internal strife and conflict, why it's called the crisis of the 3rd century. These raids led to a battle one the Romans lose, and there for the first time a Roman emperor died to a foreign army. This was the Emperor Decatus, who was infamous in the historical record for his empire-wide persecution of Christians. After those initial setbacks for the Romans, the relationship between them and the Goths mostly stabilized for the rest of the 3rd century AD, and there was trade and diplomacy between the two cultures, and the Goths during this time started converting to Christianity, and the Gothic alphabet was created using Greek and Runic letters, and the Bible was translated for the first time into Gothic. In AD 376, the Gothic world turned upside down. Where they were a stable group focused on agriculture, that all changed when into their world from stage left came the Huns, more or less the boogeyman of the late classical world. 100,000 Goths arrived at the Danube River on the northeastern border of the Roman Empire, fleeing their home. We're talking about men, women, and children, a whole population of people, a population of refugees. What the Goths say happened is out of nowhere, the Huns arrived, smashed over the Gothic armies, killed their kings, and left them two options. The first option was being absorbed into the Huns, which some of them do, becoming the Ostrogoths. And the second option was to flee and leave their homeland. Those Goths became the Visigoths. The Visigoths at the border of the Roman Empire requested asylum in exchange for their military services to Rome and a place to resettle within the empire protected from the Huns. Did Roman take them up on their offer? No, unfortunately not. It was a shame too, because Rome could have used those troops. Instead, the Romans left the Visigoths sitting on the Danube River border for 2 years. It didn't take long for disease and starvation to start setting in, and things started to get desperate. The Goths perhaps could have tried to go elsewhere, but after a century of trading with Rome, they knew Rome had the infrastructure and food to support them, and the Goths, in turn, being a militaristic, agricultural people, knew that they had the services Rome needed. Rome in the past had a history of accommodating and absorbing other cultures and peoples into their empire. Some of those peoples were the Celts, the Germans, Spanish, Greeks, North Africans, Illyrians, and lots of others. But they also had an undercurrent of being insular, xenophobic, and viewed the Italian Romans and then later the already integrated people as the true Romans over other newer groups that more recently joined and were absorbed into the empire. So when the Goths requested asylum, they were viewed as inferior and a subclass of people, and the Roman leaders, instead of looking at this as an opportunity, rather looked at this as an insurmountable problem to at best be ignored and avoided, and at worst to be exploited. The Romans took advantage of the Goths and sold them food at exorbitant rates they couldn't afford, and many Goths were forced to sell their children into slavery to the Romans in exchange for food. That might seem horrific, and it is, but if you're a Gothic parent left with the choice of either your child dying of starvation or selling them into slavery, at least they would be fed by their new Roman masters. Truly a horrific choice, though. They couldn't go home and were being stopped from going into Roman territory, despite it being potentially in Rome's best interest, and left starving and disease-ridden at the border of arguably the richest nation in the world at the time. What were they to do? Well, eventually the dam broke and the Goths crossed into Roman territory. As I mentioned previously, the Romans had incorporated other people into their empire for centuries, but they did so often over time through the military and by breaking them up into smaller, more manageable groups that could be settled in different regions. With the Goths, due to these unique circumstances, and because Rome tried to ignore the problem for years, they couldn't do that, and so the outcome was war and conflict. Most of the Eastern Roman army were south fighting the Sassanid Persians, and so the Western Roman Empire sent an army to help. Instead of waiting for that Western army to arrive, the Eastern Roman Emperor by the name of Valens attacked the Goths, and in the famous Battle of Adrianople was defeated and killed in AD 378. The Goths then pillaged the Roman province of Thrace and marched on Constantinople, only to have to turn away on account of the city's defenses being too strong. In AD 382, an arrangement was eventually reached where the Goths would settle in Roman territory, and in return, they would serve in the Roman military. Basically, the original proposal made by the Goths 6 years previous when they first arrived at the Danube requesting asylum. For the next generation after that, the Goths were in Roman territory around the Balkans and served in different Roman armies, sometimes for and often against other Romans, as Eastern Roman and Western Roman empires fought each other, trying to reunite both halves under a single emperor. In the early AD 400s, the inevitable happened. The Huns themselves arrived on the Roman border, and again the Goths, this time under their famous ruler named Alaric, again decided it was time to move west and so invaded Italy. This forced the Romans to start pulling troops off the Rhine and the Germanic borders to support Italy. This led to, in AD 406, three tribes of Germanic peoples, the Swabes, the Alans, and the Vandals, crossing the Rhine and heading west. They too were fleeing from the Huns. They went through France and into what's now Spain, and the Vandals eventually crossed into northern Africa, setting up a kingdom in the area of what used to be Carthage. And yes, those peoples are where we get the modern word of Vandal from. Going back to the story of the Goths, the Roman general holding the Western Roman Empire together, as well as holding back the Goths, the Huns, other migratory people, was a general by the name of Stilicho, ironically half Vandal himself. But he was murdered by the jealous Western Roman emperor named Honorius. This left the path free for the Visigothic ruler Alaric to march on Rome itself, and he ultimately sacked the city after Honorius denied his demands for gold, food, and the ability to settle in northern Italy. During the sacking, he was able to capture the sister of Emperor Honorius. While the sacking of the city was horrific and destructive, remember I mentioned earlier that the Goths had converted to being Christians, and so despite the attack, the churches of Rome were spared. Because Alaric sacked Rome, though, all hopes of a negotiated settlement were pretty much over. The Goths were left to continue to raid and cause strife within the Western Roman Empire. A year later, Alaric died, and his successor married Honorius' sister, perhaps to try and push for a claim to become the legitimate heir of Honorius, given that he had no children. Honorius' sister and the new ruler of the Goths had a son who shortly thereafter died, but it put pressure on Honorius to focus on pushing the Goths out of Italy into France and eventually into Spain. When Alaric's successor died in Spain, Rome finally was willing to come to a mutually agreeable peace settlement with the Goths. The Visigoths had to return Honorius' sister, and the Visigoths were allowed to stay in Spain, where they would have to fight and drive out the other Germanic peoples who I mentioned earlier who had invaded Spain when fleeing from the Huns after they crossed the Rhine. The Visigoths set up a Visigothic kingdom in southern France called the Kingdom of Toulouse, and it was while there that Attila the Hun was finally defeated. It was with a coalition army of Romans, Franks, and Visigoths, whose king died in the battle, that the Huns were defeated, and their ever-expanding progress was checked. Ironically, the Hunnic army also contained Goths. Those were the Ostrogoths that I mentioned earlier in the episode. Those were those Goths that had stayed and served under the Huns when they originally crossed into Gothic territory back in AD 376 in what's now the Ukraine. The Visigoths, with their kingdom in southern France, would in time be pushed out of France by the Franks and into Spain, where they would set up the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, which would remain until the 8th century AD, when it would fall to the Islamic Umayyad dynasty. The Ostrogoths, after Attila the Hun died, were able to extract themselves from Hunnic rule and ended up settling in the Balkans and would eventually migrate into Italy, where they would create the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. This is why I find the Goths so fascinating. Here we have a people from their own myths and belief of their history are from Scandinavia. They migrate into what's now Ukraine and Romania, are smashed by the Huns. Some are forced to serve under them, and others become refugees on the borders of the Roman Empire, where they eventually come to rule an independent kingdom in Spain and another one in Italy. Okay, so I just dumped a whole bunch of history on you while you're watching me tear down this village and build this recreation of an actual Visigothic villa. I know it's a bit of a different style and more history in a large-scale story form than I normally do, but I thought it would be good and interesting to walk through a whole overview of the Gothic people and their place in what I find to be a fascinating time in history. So with all that history and story out of the way, what did I build? Well, this structure is called Pla De Nadal and dates to the 7th century AD, and it was home to the Visigothic Count Theodomer. Theodomer ruled over 7 cities on the eastern coast of the Visigothic kingdom around the modern-day city of Valencia during the waning years of that Visigothic kingdom. In around AD 711 or 712, the Visigothic ruler, a king by the name of Roderick, was defeated by the invading Umayyads, and afterwards Theodomir continued to resist but was himself defeated in a pitched battle and had to sue for peace in AD 713. In that treaty, he had to pay tribute to the Umayyad Caliph. The people in his territory were allowed to continue to practice Christianity, and churches were allowed to stay open and function. Additionally, Theodomir was allowed to keep ruling in his land and retained his authority. He was also able to hand down his title and land to his son, though by around AD 780, that area had lost its independence. This specific structure of Pla De Nadal was built around 20 kilometers, around 12 miles, outside of Valencia by Theodomir, though when it was destroyed, whether it was in his rule or that of his sons, or perhaps later than that, isn't entirely clear, though it was destroyed in a fire. I built this replica off the excavation floor plans that I was able to uncover in my research, and that excavation was focused on the front part of the building here. So basically from this nave area and these front rooms that are symmetrical on either side. The back part of the villa structure wasn't ever excavated because it was mostly destroyed by a later orchard of orange trees, but I based it off a theoretical reconstruction that some scholars created based on what they think this part of the structure probably looked like. From a Minecraft perspective, I used a combination of these whitish and tannish blocks to replicate what the outside whitewashed plaster might have looked like, which would have coated and helped waterproof and protected the stone walls of the structure. Okay, let's head in here and I can walk you around, and keep in mind I haven't fully decorated all of the inside. And do take my internal decorations here as non-historical conjecture, as well as a bit of a compromise, as I'm using this villa as the area of my base where my villagers are going to live. As such, I had to make sure that the internal design was functional and workable for the villagers contained within them. Also, if you have any fun ways that you think that I can further decorate this interior, please drop them in the comments, and maybe I can incorporate some of those good ideas into the build in the future, and then show you how that works out. Okay, let me show you some of these other little interesting things I did incorporate into the build as Visigothic thematic choices. So if you look at these columns here, one of the interesting archaeological features in some of the Visigothic structures that still survive to this day are what's called horseshoe-shaped arches. With this arch style, the column comes up and then bumps out, only to then curve back around at the top. So basically it's shaped like a horseshoe, as you would have imagined from its name. So that's why I made them in this shape. And so you can see that I'm using these wall blocks here, and then I go up around to the stairs and then come over on top so that it kind of bumps out in this area over here. The other thing I want to point out is this central courtyard over here. Central courtyards like this are pretty typical of Roman domestic structures and villas, and I go into that in a far bit more detail in my video where I replicate the dwellings and apartments in Pompeii. But in the waning days and after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, you start seeing Roman villas, instead of being the home of a single rich family, be repurposed as areas where workshops are built out or sometimes become apartments for numerous people to live in, as well as their courtyards are changed into areas where those local inhabitants can have small enclosed gardens in some of those courtyards. So that's what I did here, and while this specific structure wasn't repurposed in that way, remember it burned in a fire, other similar villas were, and so I wanted to give a little bit of a nod to that concept in this early medieval Visigothic villa. Well, that wraps up this video. I hope you liked it, the tale of the Goths and the Visigothic build. I put a bunch of links, as I always do, to articles I used to make this episode, so please check those out if you want to learn more. Make sure you take the time to like my video and subscribe and all that stuff if you like that. And if you want to see more historical or archaeological builds from my channel, you can check those out here. Thanks, have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.